So this is our third week in our Roman Sunday School class. Obviously, we are doing this in a format that we would not consider ideal. We wish that the class was here in person. One upside of this is that people that were not able to be part of the class may be able to join in later. Pastor Ben laughs because...
Sorry.
Because those are actually verbatim his words last time. And the clear implication was his hope that people would leave the Sunday school class I was teaching and head to the Sunday school class he's teaching. Which you are, of course, welcome to do, but Jesus is watching. So anyway, we're going to be in... We're going to be in Romans 1:18 to 32 today. I do encourage you to get your Bibles and follow along with us. I do want to start by talking about a few pieces of background that those that were in the class before will be familiar with, but I think it's good to review. In the late 40s, the Roman emperor's name was Claudius. Now, Claudius was an interesting guy. He had taken over after Caligula, right, who's kind of this famous, awful emperor. And Claudius was a guy that nobody thought was a threat, or nobody expected to ever become emperor because he was crippled. And because of his being crippled, he had, instead of taking an interest in military or anything like that, become very interested in laws. And so, when he's the last man in his family, after Caligula dies, he unexpectedly becomes emperor. And he was a different kind of emperor because he was so interested in things like the legal system. And he would issue like 20 legal edicts a day. I mean, it was this incredibly active presence in Roman law. Now, at the end of towards the end of his reign in the late 40s, Claudius declared that all of the Jewish population of Rome had to leave the city. And that was probably because of, we don't know exactly why, but it was probably because of the conflict that rose up between Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews, right? So you had people going to the same synagogues, people trying to worship together, but they actually disagreed about whether or not the Messiah had come. And so the Christian Jews still frequently saw themselves as Jewish, still wanted to be a part of the synagogue, but the non-Christian Jews felt like they didn't belong there and wanted to kick them out of the synagogue. This led to all kinds of turmoil and eventually some acts of violence. And so we ended up having this time where, to just get it all to go away, Claudius expelled all Jews from the city. So then in 54 AD, Nero becomes the emperor. And Nero declared that every edict Claudius had passed, and I mean, that was a lot of edicts. Every edict that Claudius had passed was undone. Now, this was before Nero became hated. This was before the fire that you might know him for, his persecution of Christians. He came in after Claudius, and he just said everything Claudius did is undone. And so what happened is a lot of Jewish people, they had been expelled from Rome, and they'd left jobs or they'd left property. They came back hoping to retake those jobs or like reclaim that property. And it led to all of this conflict between the Jews and the Romans. There were also some prejudices that the Roman citizens had of Jews that kind of led to their being expelled and kind of developed while they were gone. And so there were all these racial tensions present in the church. And so the Gentile Christians living in Rome had a very negative view of the Jewish Christians. But then also, the Jewish Christians had a negative view of Gentile Christians, because Jews tended to struggle with this idea that they were the chosen people of God. And so they were somehow elevated above anyone else. And so a lot of them believed that in order to become a Christian, you had to become Jewish first. And so these two sides of tension kind of came together and made this really difficult situation for the church in Rome. And so what Paul is doing during his third missionary journey while he's in Corinth, he's writing a letter. And he's hoping to explain the gospel for those who are in need of understanding it better, but also to promote this reconciliation among the different ethnicities that were making up the church at the time. So if we were going to say that Paul had a single sentence summary for the book of Romans, if we were going to try to take 16 chapters and boil it all down to one sentence, I think it would be this: the gospel reveals God's righteousness. The gospel reveals God's righteousness. Now, we can see this idea being kind of previewed in what is like you could call it like the thesis statement of the book, the two verses that kind of sum up the whole message of Romans. It's Romans 1, 16 and 17. I'm going to go ahead and read them for you. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Now, I want you to pay attention to one particular part of this verse. If you're reading from an old NIV or another version of the Bible, verse 17 might say this, something like, for in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed. In my Bible, and I think correctly, it says the righteousness of God is revealed. Now, that might sound like no big deal, but I want you to hear that little difference makes all the difference in the world, because if it's a righteousness from God, then that means it's for us, and we are the main subjects of the book of Romans. I don't think we're the main subjects of the book of Romans. The book of Romans is not in the end about you, or about how you can become a Christian, or about how you can be saved. The book of Romans is about a righteous God and what he is doing in the face of sin, of a rebellious creation. And he's the main subject of the book of Romans. And that will really matter as we go forward. As we kind of go in little bits, and as we kind of get into each section, one of the things I'm going to want to do is ask Pastor Ben for feedback. So Pastor Ben, do you have any thoughts about any of this?
Not really, not so much yet. I mean, I think it's always good when we're able to try and understand the background of the letters, especially just because, it is literally somebody else's mail, and, inspired by the Holy Spirit for us, but was not written to us, right? And so I think that trying to understand kind of what was happening in the communities to which Paul, the apostles, is writing is very important. And I think that just go off the kind of the centrality of racial reconciliation in the gospel. I think that that was one of the big kind of corners that I turned in my own reading of the Bible, was to realize that, especially for Paul. I mean, it's present in the others as well, but I mean, for Paul, this was the central issue. You can see it in all of the letters.
The central issue the church was dealing with that they needed to resolve. Yeah.
Well, because I think that for Paul understood that God was forming a new people or a new community, and that meant Jews and Gentiles coming together. And if that wasn't happening, then it was maybe not a denial necessarily, but a resistance to just what God was doing in the good news. And so I think that kind of understanding that was, I think growing up, you think Jew and Gentile, well, what that's really about is, do we get our salvation by faith or by works? And it's like, well, that's actually just not what Paul's really talking about most of the time. I mean, he's actually going after this idea that one group of people is better than another, or, whatever, that Jewish Christians are a more elite class of Christian over the Gentiles, or, all those different things. But he's saying, no, actually what the gospel is doing is it's saying that there's a new kingdom, there's a new people, and being brought together in Jesus. And so I think, I like that you kind of link those things together. And just because Paul does here in those verses in 16 and 17, he links together the racial reconciliation right with the revealing or the revelation of God's righteousness.
Yeah. I agree. And something that's important to say to that is, and Ben wasn't saying otherwise, this is not to say that salvation by grace is not what we believe or not what Paul believed. It absolutely is. That's one of the reasons why people have thought that that's what's going on all the time. He's talking about the difference between Jews and Gentiles, because that is actually a theme in his letters. That is not the theme when he's differentiating, at least in Romans, between Jews and Gentiles. He's talking here about racial reconciliation from two groups that think badly of the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All
right, so what I want to do is I want to do a little bit of an overview of the passage, verses 18 to 32, before we dive into the individual verses. So what Paul's doing here is he's starting to lay out his case of why the human race is guilty and how we've kind of failed in the call and the gift we were given by being made in the image of God. So he's talking about our sinfulness, our corruption, the way we've become twisted or distorted from how God originally made us to be. Now, when you're reading Romans, this passage, especially verse 18, is a big surprise because Paul's just been talking about these wonderful things, this righteousness of God that's revealed. And then he turns immediately to talk about wrath. And that can be kind of a hard thing for us to square with or to understand. But the reason for that is because this gospel is the gospel of Jesus. And while it's all based on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, his saving work, the gospel is God's saving power. But that also means that it names the judge. And that's Jesus. And Jesus will judge the world. The same gospel that promises resurrection names the judge who's going to judge the world. And that changes everything. There's this line that I really liked while I was looking through my studying for this week. And it's from the commentary on Romans by N.T. Wright. And he says this: "Between the resurrection and the final judgment, the world lives before the unveiled gaze of the judge." Between the resurrection and the final judgment, the world lives before the unveiled gaze of the judge. And so that's this connection between the saving that happens through the resurrection and the judgment that comes at the end. The last thing I want to talk about before we dive into verse 18 is Paul's idea of sin in the book of Romans. Specifically, when Paul talks about sin in Romans, he's looking at it through the lens of idolatry. And so in the Old Testament, the word for worship and the word for serve were the same. And so this idea is that when you give your allegiance or your service to anything other than God, or before God, or that dishonors God, then that is idolatry, and that idolatry is the core of sin. And so what Paul is saying is that when we sin in this way, when we take part in idolatry, we actually are becoming less human, right? It's got this dehumanizing effect because we're made for a purpose and we're made in God's image. And so when you give your heart, your service, your allegiance to something other than God, or that dishonors him, you're becoming a little bit less of what he made you to be. So as Paul talks about sin, I want you to have that in mind. He's talking about idolatry. Now, this is also important. It's easy for us to think that idolatry is just a thing that happened a long time ago, right? When people were worshiping gods like Zeus or Jupiter, Mars or Ares, these other gods that ancient cultures worshipped. But idolatry is actually something that is absolutely present today as well. You see, idolatry, being about giving our allegiance or our service to something that dishonors God, shows up when we make the pursuit of money too much a focus in our life, or when we are too obsessed with sex or food, when we are so ready to jump to war or violence, when we do any of these things that dishonor God, that's idolatry. And Paul is saying sin is always idolatry. It's always choosing to give your allegiance or your service to something other than God. Okay, so I want to go ahead and dive into verse 18. Romans 1:18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. One of the ideas that's hard for us here is the idea of a wrathful God. I think that's because we want to be compassionate people, and we can't imagine that a God who loves, a God who is just, is also a God who would have wrath. And I think that that's a good thing for us to wrestle with. I think that wrestling with the wrath of God, means that you're a compassionate person. But I also think that it tends to be an issue that we have because most of us have never really encountered human evil. I think that it's interesting looking through the history of the church that the real wrestling with the idea of a wrathful God is pretty recent. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the world has become a much safer place to live in than it used to be. But I think that we can still imagine how, if you were a Jewish person living through the Holocaust and seeing what was happening to your people, if you were seeing what evil people were doing, I think it would become easy to understand that if God is good, there has to be a wrathful side to him. I think that if you're someone that has lived through seeing loved ones murdered, or if you're someone who has lived through seeing a warlord come into your village and take away the young men and murder anyone who resists, I think that if you're someone that has lived through real human evil, understanding that God needs wrath in order to be good comes easy. And so the idea of God's wrath is this: he loves his creation, and he loves human beings. And because he loves them, he is opposed to anything that's going to harm them. Right? And so he wants the best for you and I. He wants the best for this thing that he's created, this world that he's created, and anyone or anything that's going to harm it, God is completely opposed to. And I think that really helps me to get my head around this idea of wrath. So, Pastor Ben, I wanted to kind of turn this over to you.
Yeah, I think yes, and I think it's interesting. Just the phrase is being revealed in verse 18 caught my eye, just because of I don't think it's necessarily a contrast, but just so you talk about that Paul's single sentence summary is that the gospel is a revelation of God's righteousness, which is what he says up here in 17, right? For in it, the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, and then says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And so I guess maybe a question I have is, like the revelation of God's righteousness, that's good news, and Paul will get into that a little later in the letter, but in some ways, I don't want to say it's bad news, but in some ways it could be like bad news, because the revelation of God's righteousness is also the revelation of his wrath. Well, and I think as well, part of this that is good to keep in mind and is, as Romans goes on, Paul will talk more about the nature of what sin is, and almost like sin with a capital S. It's kind of a force or an agent all on its own. And I agree with all that. That I think that the wrath of God, that there is a divine no that's said toward human mistreatment and injustice of one another, that he will not allow that to go on forever. And but also kind of thinking of that kind of maybe bigger picture idea of like that sin as a force kind of unto itself that has people in its grip. And again, kind of in the biblical image of like Egypt, Egypt is the whole thing, right? The system or the empire, that, and everything else that has people enslaved. That even going back to that allegiance idea, somebody who comes to faith in Jesus, pledges their allegiance to Jesus, we obviously still struggle with things, do bad things, make mistakes, right? But like what has changed, or one of the things that has changed, that not only has our allegiance changed, but also like who we belong to, or kind of what our citizenship is, has also changed. Just thinking through that, God's wrath against the power of sin, in the flesh of Jesus, as Paul talks about in Romans. So it's like, I guess maybe an important part of this is for me to think through that I think that God he's not opposed to us, right? Like it's not that, Paul said, even though we were enemies, so to speak, like Christ still dies for us. It's like God is still wanting to redeem and restore people, even as maybe his wrath is being revealed against them. And in fact, God's wrath coming to bear in somebody's life could be part of what saves them. I think that ultimately there's kind of an ultimate wrath of like the, kind of the backstop on the day of judgment and things like that. But I guess just putting those out there, other ways, or not other ways, but just kind of ways that I also kind of just think about God's wrath and maybe how it makes sense in kind of Paul's big picture with Romans.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of that, I think it's that clash of kingdoms idea that we've talked about with the Gospel of Mark, that's where that clash is occurring, like that's where not only where God's wrath is, but also God's righteousness. And I think we see that on the cross, right? The cross is the revelation of God's righteousness and God's wrath.
One of the things that's odd about this format that we're doing is there's no class to interact with. So all the reading and talking I just did would have normally been, hopefully, a dual engagement. But I would love to hear from you. Do you have any questions about God's wrath or any thoughts about it? I don't know that we'll have answers, but we're very good at listening to questions, and would love to dialogue with you about that. I do want to move on a little bit. So verses 19 to 21. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So basically what Paul's doing is he's explaining or fleshing out verse 18 here. In other words, he says that God's self-revelation has been displayed by what can be known from the natural world. And that revelation takes place in the created order, which means that all people are without excuse. And so, since humanity has refused to honor God in the appropriate way, that's the reason that the wrath of God is coming. So then verses 22 and 23, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal being, and birds and animals and reptiles. So Paul's describing where sin comes from here. We all have this instinct to worship God. When we refuse to know him through creation, that instinct gets corrupted and becomes idolatry. And again, it may be easy for us to think that idolatry is a thing that happened a lot in the past, but we think about the worship of money. The ancients believed that there was a god of greed and wealth, and there were steps that you took to worship that god. Well, we don't usually think of things in that way, but a lot of our actions with regard to money certainly do look like worship. They look like allegiance and service to the accumulation and honor of money, or of sexuality, right? Sexual love. There used to be a well-known god for that in a lot of cultures. We don't have a god for that or a goddess for that, but it is certainly something that if we look around at our culture, we can see a lot of people living as though they're acting in allegiance and service to sexual love or war or any one of a number of different things that we could say are sins within the human heart, that when we act in service to those sins, we are actually giving devotion, allegiance, and worship to something that is not God. We're in the midst of idolatry. And one of the things that really grabbed me about this verse, one of the neatest things about this passage, is the way Paul is kind of retelling the story of Genesis 3, the fall here. Instead of recognizing wisdom as something that comes from God, that we receive by worshiping and serving him, humans grabbed for wisdom independently. So he says, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being. And so you can picture in the garden, Adam and Eve believing that they're going to get wisdom from the fruit. And instead, that's not what happens. Instead, what they get is foolishness. But the actions they take are toward trying to get wisdom. And I think that's a very interesting perspective here on this passage, is that Paul is talking a little bit about the Genesis 3. You have any thoughts about any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the major ways that our worldview is different from ancient people, different scholars and things will talk about how kind of after the Middle Ages and the kind of the dawn of the scientific revolution is that our world was kind of disenchanted. And what they mean by that is that once upon a time, every aspect of human life, the tools we used, all of the places we could go, the seasons, the times of day, like they all had a spiritual component. And everybody understood that. And that was just part of what all ancient people understood. And I think that for us, we live in a disenchanted world, which means when we think about something like the stock market or our bank accounts or our car or soccer, like spiritual things don't really have anything to do with that apart from like a general we want to honor God. But I think that ancient people would have many, many different opinions. Sports is a good example because for the most part, in a lot of ancient religions, like there were games, but they were intimately associated with the mythology, which is actually still true. We just don't, maybe we don't think about that quite as much these days. And so I think that, in just terms of like reflecting on idolatry in our own lives, that everything we do as image bearers, it's reflecting something, right? Like it is an expression of really allegiance to something. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the creator. And I think that part of what Paul's saying here is in our fallen state, because of what Adam and Eve did, and because of just, again, the power of sin that we're under, so much of what we do is idolatrous. So much of what we do is actually in service to things that are not God. First and foremost, ourselves, right? Like I think, and he says that humans, or where is it here? They exchange the glory of the immortal God, which is what men and women had, right? They exchanged that for images made to look like a mortal human being, right? And then also birds and animals and reptiles. And so I think that could just be profitable for us to remember that, is that for Paul, and for many people in the ancient world, and for many people still today, that we really do live in an enchanted world, that all things have a spiritual component to them. And we can just kind of think about that or try and reflect on that in terms of how we use or what we do or how we spend our time or our money or whatever else. Like all of those things are actually expressions of spiritual allegiance.
So the original plan was to go all the way through verse 32. I think that we've spent enough time going through this far. I do want to say one thing here. If we're gonna sum up Paul's argument in these passages, it's going to be that the ones who worship the true God are renewed according to the divine image to be like Him, right? And so there's this renewing effect that worshiping God has on a human being. But when that worship is exchanged for idolatry, the result is that our humanness is lessened or attacked or defaced or infected or distorted or twisted, whatever you want to say, for the word sin. And that picture of the health of worshiping the true God and the unhealth of idolatry, the righteousness of worshiping the true God, the sin of idolatry. However it helps you best to picture it, the question I would ask is, or the challenge I would have is for you to look into your own heart and ask, what struggles do you have with idolatry? If you were going to look on the outside of your life in, what would you perceive your idols to be? And I think that's a really tough question for us to wrestle with, but I think it's a really important one for us to wrestle with. The other thing I do want to say is I suggest this to my class. You read through the first 8 chapters of Romans, because that's how far the class is going to go, hopefully. But that you look through and you look for all those places where Gentile and Jew are kind of separated and talked about as both being at fault or both being receiving the blessings from God, and these kind of reconciling passages coming together. And if you can see this theme of racial reconciliation running through the book of Romans. All right. I think that's it for now. So thank you for being part of this. Thank you for hanging in for about half an hour. We will see you later. Well, hello, and welcome to Romans with Pastors Ben and Clayton.
Are you going to talk like that the whole time?
What are you talking about? This is my normal speaking voice.
Okay.
Well,
We've been alone for too long, I think, officially. How about, like, after every page, you just stop and ask for a response? I mean, I don't know. And if I don't have much to say, we can continue on. I mean, I don't know. Or every half a page, or, I don't know.
we're just going to do it live. We're going to figure it out.
All right. I'm ready.
Well,
only 2 brain cells.
that's going to stay in.